This video is about the unit circle. So how the unit circle works is that it uses triangles to measure any point in the circle. You'll notice that any line that you draw from the center is going to create a right triangle. These triangles superimpose themselves onto the circle. The angle of the triangle gives you the position on the circle. So the angles going around the circle are 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Technically, 0 and 2 pi are the same angle. Also, the unit circle is split up into quadrants. As for the triangle, cosine is on the x-axis and sine's on the y-axis. Cosine goes left and right, sine goes up and down. If you ever get confused on which one's which, just remember SOHCAHTOA. In SOHCAHTOA, you'll notice that sine is equal to opposite over hypotenuse. The opposite of this angle is this one right here, which is the y-axis. Likewise for cosine. Cosine is the adjacent angle, so it's this one right here. So because of this, the unit circle has two parts to it: the angle and the position. If you stick the angle into a trigonometric function, you can get a position. And actually, the reverse is true. If you have a position and you do an inverse trig function on it, you can get an angle. So one of the more interesting things to note about this is that you can use the Pythagorean theorem to get one of the most fundamental identities in precalc. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. Okay, so now you know the basics of how the unit circle works. I'm going to show you how to get the angles and positions of the first quadrant. And I'll show you later on that as long as you know the first quadrant, you can get all the other quadrants pretty easily. Now this is just a memorization trick, so bear with me. First, you're going to write 1, 2, 3, and then you're going to write 3, 2, 1. Everything gets a 2, and everything gets a square root. Square root of 1 is just 1, so you don't have to worry about that. This is sine, and this is cosine. Sine starts from 0 to 1, and cosine starts from 1 to 0. The angles are 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, and pi over 2. Now, if you're ever not sure about which one's which, if sine starts from 0 or 1, just keep in mind the general shape of sine and cosine. Sine looks like this, like a backwards S. Cosine looks like this. It's like a U. The first quadrant's here on sine and here on cosine. Sine starts from 0 to 1, and cosine starts from 1 to 0. So the other thing that I want to explain real quick is the 6 trigonometric functions. It's not just sine and cosine, there's 4 others. There's tangent, cosecant, secant, and cotangent. But the general rule of thumb is that you don't want to deal with these 4. Like, they're annoying and I wouldn't want to deal with them if I were you. So what I would do is I convert them into sine and cosine. So for example, tangent is the same thing as sine over cosine. Cosecant is 1 over sine, secant is 1 over cosine, and cotangent is cosine over sine. So how does this work? If you had sine of pi over 3, you can easily get this, which is root 3 over 2. And then going a step further, how do you get tangent of pi over 3? Well, you know that tangent is equal to sine over cosine. So you can rewrite it and say tangent of pi over 3 is equal to sine of pi over 3 over cosine of pi over 3, which is root 3 over 2 over 1 over 2, which equals root 3. And just to give you a small refresher on whether or not this is true, you can rewrite this as saying root 3 over 2 divided by 1 over 2, and then keep change flip to get root 3 over 2 times 2 over 1, which equals root 3. Okay, so how do you translate this to the other quadrants? you'll notice that whenever you draw out a triangle from the center, that triangle is always going to be oriented toward the x-axis. Basically, that angle that you get is going to mirror the angle that you get in the first quadrant. We call those reference angles. So for example, the reference angle in quadrant 2 is going to be pi minus the angle. In quadrant 3, it's going to be the angle minus pi. And in quadrant 4, it's going to be 2 pi minus the angle. Now for the record, you don't have to memorize this. As long as you see it, you should be okay. I'll show you some examples so you can get your feet wet at least. So say for example, on an exam, you're told to find sine of 5 pi over 4. Your first step in this is to find out which quadrant this is in. And it's best to draw a number line to see which quadrant if you can't get it right away. Now this is going to be in the third quadrant. So you're going to do 5 pi over 4 minus pi, which equals pi over 4. So that's your reference. And you notice that sine goes in this direction, which means it's negative. Also, you can do all students take calc and see that sine is negative in the third quadrant, which means it's negative. Now, one more thing to add real quick is that you can go in the reverse direction too. Inverse trig implies that you've already cut the domain. And because functions need to be one-to-one, one position should give you one angle. And that's it. Hopefully this should be enough to get you started.